Now, let's take a look at how we arrive at healthy sexuality. How do we become healthy heterosexuals? In your notes, you'll see on page 4, we have understanding the origins of sexual problems. Let's turn to that, and you'll find under point number 1, how do we become healthy heterosexuals? Now, those of you who are here, and most of you who will be watching, you did not choose to become a heterosexual person. In that I did not choose to become homosexually oriented, well, you did not choose one day, oh gee, out of all the life choices, I think I'll like the opposite sex. It didn't happen that way for you, did it? You just sort of arrived there, didn't you? Why is that? Now, you're not genetically programmed to be heterosexual. You are genetically programmed to be sexual, to have potential sexuality. How did you arrive then at opposite sex attraction? And what about the many heterosexual people who are not healthy in their identity, who are insecure, who do not have healthy relationships? They may like the opposite sex, they may not be homosexual, but their heterosexuality is not healthy. Of the 19 sexual deviations we looked at in past teaching, we recognize that many of those problems occur among heterosexually oriented people. So how do we then arrive at becoming a healthy heterosexual? Let's take a look at that model. In fact, let's step over and take a look at this simple diagram here. You can follow along in your notes where I have not actually given you this drawing, but you will see the parallel to it as we follow here from stage 1 through to stage 4. All right? Now, we want to go from childhood into adulthood, where we will arrive at healthy heterosexuality. But this is not a choice. It is actually a developmental conclusion. If we go through stages 1, 2, and 3, we will arrive at 4, and if we arrive at 4, we will have the consequential product, the conclusion of healthy heterosexuality. Okay? Now, we're going to look at the pattern of the development of a young male. We will look specifically at the male because, unlike the male is actually at much greater risk than the female in terms of psychosexual development. We'll talk more about the female following this. Now, here's the little boy. Daddy, mommy, obviously. Now, does the little boy here choose to become a heterosexual years down the road? Of course not. A child is born with need. Children are born with an empty cup in terms of their identity and in terms of their security. They are not born equipped with identity and security. In that sense, they are born with potential, but it is not yet developed. Who must develop that? Is it the child's responsibility to figure out that he's a boy and how to find security? Of course not. Children are born with need. Who is to fill that need? Mommy and daddy, the parental bond. Now, when a child is born, after that umbilical cord is cut, the next closest attachment that sustains life will be with mommy. Baby boy is first bonded with mommy. This is where we find that incredible model of breastfeeding. Not only is it just very practical in that there is this available resource that provides physical nourishment, also we know that breast milk provides immunities for baby. Baby's system does not come complete, and baby's system must receive that extra charge that mommy's immunities will provide. Also, I might add that breastfeeding helps the mommy's uterus to contract and shrink back to original size following birth much more quickly. And even while she must eat more food to breastfeed, the fact is she burns up even more calories, so she loses weight while she eats, while she breastfeeds. How like God to invent such a system. And studies have shown that babies who are breastfed are actually more psychologically nourished, not just physiologically nourished. Because baby's field of vision is limited, baby can look right up into that limited field of vision but see mommy's face clearly, hear mommy's heartbeat, touch mommy's skin. All of this provides an important nourishment for the soul called security. Babies want to be attached to mommy, which is why even studies of tribal children, they are often better off than Western children because the mommies strap those babies to their bodies. And if mommy has to go work out in the field and pick corn all day, at least baby is there, tightly attached to mommy, the first source of nourishment. Now, this was God's design, and how like man to come up with the plastic breast. How like man to take babies and detach them from parents, and now because we're affluent, we put them in a room several feet completely disconnected away. How sophisticated we are now that we're so indebted to getting our greeds met that we must go to work and leave baby at home in the care of other people who have no real emotional bond to child. But this is the way of the modern sophisticated world. We prove again how much more than God we really know. We prove again how much it affects children because their deepest needs for security are often unsatisfied. Children crave security, and this is why in early childhood, when parents have to separate their children and put them in the nursery or put them in the daycare or leave them in the Sunday school, little children naturally cry out and cling for mommy and daddy. Do you know why? Because that is the source of security, and the child's cup is not yet filled up. So the child reacts and says, I don't know who these strangers are. I want to be attached to you. But see, we are very convenience-oriented and very self-oriented. And I want to go hear the sermon, or I want to go get the job done. I want to go meet my needs, and so I don't care whether this makes baby insecure. I'm going to go get my thing done, and baby's just going to have to cope. Would you say that's pretty much the modern mentality? I do not say this to slash and burn people. I do not say this to condemn anybody. I'm just saying I think that we need to look at the original model that God designed and get a clue. Now, this separation anxiety, again, tells us that when children are fearful of being separated from parents, parents are obviously then the source of security, particularly the young child's attachment to mommy. The first source of security. And isn't the foundation of a healthy identity security? It gives the soul rest. It makes us not driven when we are secure. Okay? Now, the little boy child must go through a process of separation from mommy and must learn reattachment toward daddy because mommy will not be the source of identity. Mommy, no matter how loving she is, will never be the male figure that the little boy must pattern his life after. Little boys must go through a process that little girls do not. The little boy must detach from his relationship with mommy as primary source and must reattach onto daddy. But now little boys don't know that they need to do that. So who is responsible before God to initiate that? Obviously, daddy. Unfortunately, we live in a world where daddies often do not understand this. They do not recognize their responsibility. They've never been taught this, and they often feel that just fulfilling financial obligations to the family, providing authority and discipline, is really the fulfillment of their role, and this is sadly mistaken. Daddies should occupy as much nurturing role as mommy, and particularly for the male child, because where else will little boy derive his identity from? That which is the big model of what he will one day become, daddy. And so it was in God's design that daddy would initiate this weaning process and the reattachment onto him that he will initiate, where he begins to get involved with his little boy. Particularly, this begins to occur naturally between about the ages of 2 to 5. It should already have been accomplished. Daddies play differently than mommies. Daddies relate differently. In fact, mommy is often considered the ultimate unconditionally safe home base. But daddy is actually that bridge from home to the outside world of function beyond the safety of home. And daddy's like that buffer zone that encourages the development of that male ego strength. It requires daddy's investment in little boy. You're going to be a man like daddy. Daddy should be a desirable model that shows what it's like to interact with wife. And you'll be like that too one day. And daddy should be there to intervene when the bully is on the block. Daddy can help little boy to go out there and face challenges in life. Daddy can show little boy how to navigate through life and to spend time and invest in little boy. Tragically, there are many fathers that when little boy does not show the same interests as daddy, that daddy doesn't try to bend and be flexible to cultivate healthy maleness in the little boy at his level of interest. Rather, the fathers often punish little boy because little boy doesn't share those same interests. He sends a signal to little boy, well, because you don't like the same sports that I do, I'm going to spend time with your brother who does. Or because you're an artist and sensitive, but I wanted you to be tough and an athlete, I'm not going to like you as much. This is the kind of language that often fathers who are immature will send to their little boys. And instead of cultivating a healthy, ego-secure man who is sensitive and artistic, he ends up rejecting that little boy, making the boy feel inferior because he didn't please daddy. He didn't have the same interests. Do you follow me? This requires maturity on the part of the father, that if little boy doesn't share the same interests, then that was by God's design to challenge father to grow, to cultivate a healthy little boy. But see, we're often very selfish, aren't we? And unfortunately, it is our children who grow up and they suffer insecurity. So mommy provides security, but daddy adds to that security the important element of identity that comes from identification and bonding with daddy. Follow me? Then we have to cross a bridge of risk. At this time, the kid begins to leave the comfort and security of home life, and he must cross a bridge of risk. What kind of risk? Risk to identity, ego, and risk to security. That means reaching out to the world beyond the comfort zone of home. Now, some of you who are parents, you'll remember that when your child was first dropped off in Sunday school, your child probably reacted with fear. That's very normal. And I'm not saying that dropping your child off at Sunday school, if he cries or she cries, is bad. Of course, we do have to sometimes wean our children even when they are not comfortable with it. But here's perhaps the better way to do it. Instead of just shoving your kid into the classroom, it might be better that you inconvenience yourself for a couple of weeks, maybe 3 or 4, and that you go into that classroom with your child, and that you let that child sit on your lap, and as that child sees that the other children in that room are not wolves, the child will begin to climb off your lap and begin to interact with you as the safety base in case he or she needs to run back to you. But in time, that child will cross that bridge of risk and begin relating to their peer group. And then you know what your kid will do? Once your kid feels reasonably secure, having crossed that bridge of risk, and the threat is gone, your kid will probably say something like this: "You can leave now. Would you get out?" See, that means they've negotiated that bridge of risk. They're no longer feeling threatened. They know now they can face that challenge. They've crossed the risk bridge, and they've begun to integrate with their same-sex peer group. Now notice I said same-sex peer group. This phenomenon is true for little girls, but more true for little boys, and parents of male children see this. Little boys, before puberty, they are not interested in erotic or romantic relationships with girls. Girls are ooh, but they are very concerned about being accepted by and identifying with their peer group of the same sex. Do you know why? This further consolidates and solidifies a sense of identity with their own kind and provides additional sense of security. I'm not only a boy because daddy says so, I'm accepted by others who are like me. And again, as I've shared with you before little boys grow up and become men who like women, they must first feel secure and bonded and identified with daddy, and that must be solidified by their same-sex peer group. Make sense? Then this will last, goodness, it can last, throughout the teen years, from 5-ish until 15, 16. Little boys are not really interested in little girls, romantically or erotically, but they are very much involved in intimate, challenging, affectionate camaraderie among their same-sex peers. Very normal in psychological development. Then we hit puberty, that little wavy line there. And then those biochemical urges come to the surface and you see the world in a strange and wonderful way. Occasionally, homosexual experimentation may occur here. Do you know why? Because there has already been so much physical intimacy for years with the same sex. And they've been used to seeing each other naked or seeing their bodies develop. And there may be some temporary homosexual experimentation, like I'll show you mine if you show me yours, that kind of thing that horrifies parents, but at the same time, it's really not truly psychodynamically driven homosexuality. It's very temporary, and it's really not deeply entrenched or anything like that. Not that I think experimentation is necessarily healthy or good, but neither is it this deeper driven homosexual orientation that we typically think of. So usually they drop that phase very quickly. Now, initially when boys are moving out of the same-sex attraction phase, they don't just jump into opposite-sex attraction when their hormones kick in. Actually, they have to cross another bridge of risk, and it's very threatening, again, to the sense of identity and security. It's like a test. See, this was a test, wasn't it? Will the boys accept me? Now, here's a test again. Will the girls recognize me as a man? And it's quite a test to the fragile, insecure, and emerging male ego to put his ego on the line to ask a girl out, to begin interacting with the opposite sex. Often, teenagers boast of great bravado and exploits. Often, there's all this machismo, in the insecure male ego. Why? Well, of course, because they do feel so threatened, because this girl has the power to say, nah, not interested. And that's very hard for a male ego to take. So teenagers do not wake up in puberty and say, where's a woman? They actually they face the opposite sex with insecurity, anxiety, angst. That's normal. And that's where the male is leaning back heavily upon his male peers. Oh, I'm afraid to ask her out. Go ahead and ask her out. But I'm afraid that she'll think I'm a nerd. You are a nerd, but ask her out anyway. That's where little boys becoming men here begin to have those talks with dad, not just about sex, but about, well, gee, Dad, what was it like when you were dating Mom? Well, son, and that's where the boy who's becoming a man gets backup. He gets that support in crossing this bridge of risk, because now, you see, the test is on his shoulders, and it's cause for interest and anxiety. And that's normal as the man begins to develop in his teenage years. Now, I don't know about you, but when you learned to drive a car, it probably wasn't just running out there, jumping in, and taking off with confidence. But if you're like most people who learn to drive a car, you look at every gauge and every mirror and you drive and you remember those lectures that you heard from your driving instructor or your parents. Now, son, This vehicle can be a marvel of transport and convenience, or it can be an unparalleled weapon of death and destruction. Well, it is the truth. And so when you start to drive a car, you're nervous, you're filled with anxiety, but you know what? You do it enough and you become competent and confident. Now, all the risks are still there, but you feel more confident and competent in driving that vehicle as you practice and get used to it, right? Well, in a similar way, that analogy applies in opposite sex relating. Initially, there's anxiety, and yet you carry through and you begin to develop confidence, not only as a man among the men, but in your opposite sex relating. And a lot of the fear begins to diminish, and you're willing to take those risks, knowing that if a girl dumps you or rejects you, you're not necessarily a failure as a man. That's just part of the risk-taking in opposite sex relating. Okay? Now, men who are very insecure are not very likely to take that risk, are they? They'll either wish to conquer women and dominate women to prove that they're men, mostly to themselves, or they'll be passive and they'll withdraw altogether from trying. They'll feel threatened by women. Okay? We can find there the seeds of heterosexual promiscuity, where men wish to dominate women. Or we find often the seeds of homosexual distancing from women, and why there is no opposite sex attraction, because they feel too threatened to even attempt to take that test, because their manhood is so insecure. You follow me? Now, what happens during this stage is our sex drive has begun to awaken. And so instead of it becoming focused here, we've grown beyond our same-sex interest. Our cup has been filled up. And now, as we're becoming opposite sex interested, because we're now beginning to be attracted to that which is different than we are, that's when our sex drive awakens and it begins to attach itself to our developing opposite sex interest, because our same-sex need has already been fulfilled. Do you follow me? As our sex drive begins to awaken here, we begin to see it integrate with our desire for companionship and intimacy with that which is opposite from the same sex. We are drawn to complete ourselves in the opposite sex, which was God's design, right? God made woman to complete man. Man is weak and imperfect. He must have this union with woman to complete himself by God's design. Then we merge into adulthood here at level 4. We finally find Miss Right. We date, we marry, we mate, in that order, I pray. And then we find that we've crossed that final bridge of risk where we are willing to commit to one other human being in a covenant relationship for the rest of our lives on this planet. That is a bridge of risk, because in addition to the rewards that come with marriage, there is risk and there is responsibility. That's why God intended sex to be reserved for marriage, because after all, it's sort of a reward for those who are willing to take the risks and responsibilities. And people who will not, they cheat. And in fact, when they cheat and have sex before marriage, even if they marry that one that they have sex with, do you know what? Studies have indicated the risk of divorce for people who are not virgin and who have premarital sex. Their risk of divorce is not just 50% higher, it is 50 times higher, even if they marry the one they've been having sex with. Do you know why that is? First of all, because often if you're having sex before marriage, that indicates immaturity and a spiritual condition that is not submitted to the Lord. It may indicate also emotional and relational damage, but quite apart from that, it also sows into a relationship the seeds of disrespect, and they began to grow years into the relationship. Because everybody who has sex before marriage, they really, truly, deeply know that they're not supposed to. God says He has put His law in our hearts. And so regardless of all the cultural rationale and all the hormones, people who have sex before marriage, they sow into their relationships the seeds of destruction. Now make no mistake, if that's your case, I'm not saying you're doomed to divorce. I'm saying if we recognize it and confess it as sin, and we ask God to forgive it, and we ask our partner to forgive us, and we ask for cleansing and restoration in that area, then God can indeed bring that kind of cleansing and restoration. But we need to ambush what has been sabotaged by intervening and asking God to forgive it and cleanse it and establish Him as Lord over our disobedience with our bodies in that relationship. So we arrive at level 4. We cross this bridge of risk through marriage. No wonder people call it cold feet. It's quite an awesome pledge that we make, and yet we do it. We cross that bridge of risk, and then we finally have our first sexual experience under God's blessing. And there we find spiritual, emotional, and physical satisfaction. And maybe not all at once, because some people, even here when they get married, their wedding night or their wedding week or their first month of marriage, the sex may not always be very satisfying because we've got two unlearned people who are having to learn to enjoy and pleasure each other. There can be nervousness and awkwardness and even physical discomfort if there isn't sensitivity and awareness. And so the first month, I encourage people when they get married, don't make your sexual performance a big deal. You've got the rest of your lives to figure it out, and it probably won't take you the rest of your lives. So back off and lighten up and have a good sense of humor. Rather than cry about it, why don't you laugh? And enjoy learning to love each other physically. Don't make it such an almighty big deal. Sex is only one slice in the pie of your life. If you find that you're having difficulties, then go get some good advice from someone who counsels in that area. Don't let shame and pride and fear dominate you. Work it out. Then you will be free to enjoy a good intimate union, recognizing that sex in marriage is only an extension of good verbal communication. When couples lose good verbal communication, they generally lose good sexual communication. Communication and commitment are what make this union, not your sexual performance. If you do not have commitment and communication, your sex life will not keep your marriage together. But if your sex life isn't working out really good at first, or if it runs into problems later, particularly with the onset of children or with physical problems later, your marriage can still thrive, not just survive, as long as there is good commitment and communication. Sex is a form of communication. So when good communication breaks down in your marriage relationship, your sex life goes down the tubes, almost universally. Then, when we have our first sexual experience with God's blessing on it, emotionally, spiritually, and physically, we experience a very positive reward, and that is how we arrive here at healthy heterosexuality. Up to this point, everything is actually a pre-heterosexual condition. It's like the concrete is not set. It is wet and molded, but here it begins to firm up and become set. Your gender identity, you know that you're a boy or a girl at about the age of 5, although you don't know what that means. But your sexual orientation, studies have shown, is much more moldable and flexible between the ages of 18 and 35. In Hebrew culture, men were not even considered adult or finished, mature, until they were 30. Even though they were accepted as responsible for their own sins and they were initiated into the fellowship of men at the age of 13, they were not considered grown-up males until the age of 30. Now we can understand conversely here that if daddy and son do not bond, son will remain more over-attached to mommy as the main source of unconditional love and security. And son will not have a healthy sense of security and identity, particularly with daddy and his same-sex peers. And that will sabotage this because he will feel insecure and unwilling to take that risky test. And that will affect his opportunity for this, and he will not probably arrive here. Granted, I'm talking in very generalistic blanket statement terms that are not absolute, but nonetheless, they give you an understanding that if this foundation, things don't work out right, It will have consequences down the road. Do you follow me? And while it doesn't always result in homosexuality, it will result in a man who probably becomes dominant of other women in an effort to cover up and mask his insecurity. He will become aggressive, the class bully who becomes the heterosexually promiscuous macho man. Or he will become the class clown. He will try to distract people from the fact that he is so insecure and mask his weakness by distraction. Or he will become passive and withdrawn. He will not feel confident to relate to the same sex in his peer group and will ever feel on the outside looking in. This is the group that often becomes picked on by the bullies. They zero in on weak people, and the weak person is too passive to fight back, and he hates the abuse that he receives, but he lacks the ability to stand up and hit back and face that challenge. Consequently, it makes him feel even more inadequate and insecure, even further distanced from ever bonding with the same sex. And it is here very often that we run into the stereotypical male homosexual. Missing daddy's love and bonding, he doesn't have a healthy sense of identity or security. That cripples same-sex bonding. Then he never grows beyond this point, which is why many clinicians view the homosexual condition as arrested emotional development. The intellect will develop, the body will develop, but relationally, development stops at about this stage. That is why the male homosexual does not have so much of a romantic sexual interest in women. What 7-year-old little boy does. The 7-year-old little boy on the inside is not able to take that threatening test of interest in the opposite sex. He is still trying to find peer group acceptance and perhaps a daddy substitute, which is why the male homosexual so stereotypically is attracted to men who have all of the masculine qualities that he feels he lacks, just like a little boy attracted to the bigger image of the powerful daddy figure he should have bonded with. Tragically, though, because this need was not satisfied here, when the person goes through puberty, that unmet emotional need suddenly is unfortunately attached with emerging sexual drive. And thus we have an emotional deficit combined with a sexual drive, thus resulting in a same-sex fixation, and opposite-sex interest is arrested. Do you follow me? Now, this does not explain every type of homosexual development, but it is perhaps the most typical of the stereotypical homosexual that you think of living the gay life, still looking for some man to complete his identity and fill him up from what he is lacking because he didn't get it. Do you follow me? Again, we're not talking in absolutes, we're talking in general terms. But this is just one way we can look at what happens in development of identity and how it is not a choice. It is a conclusion, for good or for bad, based on relationships. We can also begin to understand with this model that if there is sexual molest, or if there are other factors like exposure to pornography, if there is involvement in the teenage years in heterosexual sex, how all of that can condition us and influence us to warp us off the track from arriving at healthy heterosexuality. Make sense? This is why relationships are so very crucial to us. This is why we need to understand God's view toward broken people. He never excuses sin, but he does look beyond just what we do here that is sinful, and he can look back because God is past, present, and future. He can look back through the past and easily see why Johnny arrived here or why Johnny did not. And I'm glad we serve that kind of God. It doesn't excuse sin, but it does give us compassion to understand. And that's why if relationships have not fed you and you're still starving, that is why Jesus said, "And I am the bread of life, and I am the living water." That is why he said in Psalm 68, verse 6, "I put the lonely, the emotionally disconnected and starving in the family." That is why, as I shared from my own story, Psalm 107 says, "God satisfies the thirsty and he fills the hungry with the good thing." That is why all of the commandments come down to those two key factors: be in right relationship with God and right relationship with each other. We can't go backward in time and fix what was missing, but we can go forward in time in Christ and compensate with healthy relationships today and tomorrow. Does that make sense?